Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to give it another minute just for a few other folks to join us. We'll have to review some minutes, so I want to make sure we have a quorum. Hey, Ruby, this is Alicia. I wanted to see if that was you under community development.
Yes, that's me.
Okay. All right. Well, good afternoon again to all. I know we still have a few folks trickling in. I want to go ahead and call the October 28th, 2020 meeting to order. A few housekeeping things. We have a lot of information only on today. We will have to take a vote on one of the agenda items. So, Miss Ruby, if you can help me keep track of our folks in this meeting for our quorum. In the event we haven't achieved our quorum by the time we get to the second agenda item, we will come back to that, and that's reviewing the minutes. So good afternoon again. My name is Alicia Thompson, the HSAC chair for this year. Just to review our goals for HSAC. So our goals are to finish the job of ending chronic homelessness, prevent and end veterans homelessness, prevent and end homelessness for families, youth, and children, and set a path to ending all types of homelessness. So just a few housekeeping. I know that we are all in this Zoom call together, but I know certain ones of us are HSAC members and certain of us are, specific ones of us are in the gallery. So when I open up the floor for comments or questions, I will direct that to the HSAC members initially, and then I will open it up to our community guests. So if folks can be mindful of that. So let me check in with Ruby. Yes, we have a quorum. Great. So if folks, you should have received in an email from Community Development our minutes from August 26, 2020 and September 30th, 2020. You should have received those minutes in your email. Please, if you haven't done so already, please take a moment to review those minutes. So I'll give you a minute now. And I will entertain a motion to accept.
Move to approve.
Staying in their home. For landlords.
To Birch, I'm sorry.
And for your utility companies shutting off the power. Our NC Hope initiative remains available to assist families.
few housekeeping things. Let's remember to mute our mics. We're reviewing our minutes now for August 26th and September 30th. So I am willing to entertain a motion to accept minutes.
Yes, I said move to approve.
Officials and everybody else.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Birch.
A second, this is Colleen Herbert.
Thank you, Colleen. Second by Colleen. Thank you. So thank you. Minutes have been reviewed and approved for August 26th and September 30th. Moving right along, we have public comment on the agenda. So let me open up the floor to see if there is a public comment from anybody. And Ruby, let me check in with you. Was anything submitted to community development? Okay, so being that there is no public comment, we will move right along. We have Performance Management Committee quarterly report. So our committee chair, Jonathan Crooms, you have some information for us?
I sure do. Thanks, Alicia, and good afternoon to everybody. I will try to keep my report very brief. As you may know from our last meeting and even this one here, most of the work of the Performance Management Committee has been centered around reviewing applications for the Emergency Solutions Grant Program, as well as the combined funding application. The combined funding application I'll talk about a little bit later. So that has really taken up kind of the bulk of our work over the past 2 months. I do want to say a special thanks to Janine, Chris, Ebony, Alicia, and Sharita for being on those scoring committees. Without their help, we certainly couldn't have gotten that done. A few other things that we are working on. There is a HMIS data quality monitoring policy subcommittee that is doing some work within the Performance Management Committee. And their work is continuing, and we hopefully will have an update by our December meeting. The next item that we are taking up and will be probably spending a good bit of time on is reviewing and updating the COC performance and the COC written standards. We are forming a committee to do that. Certainly, Performance Management Committee members are invited to participate as they are able, but this subcommittee is also open to other HSAC members and to our projects in the community. And the reason for that is that the written standards are things that are very tangible standards that affect how we evaluate how our projects are doing. And certainly our projects should certainly have some say in that. Even if you are a project that is not funded through ESG or the combined funding application, we do invite you to be part of this because, again, everybody who's part of the continuum of care, I mean, there is a standard out there that, that we ask each project to, to abide by. And so regardless of where your funding comes from, it's important to have your voice in the process as we revisit those and update them. And so with that, I will stop right there. And actually, I will say if you're interested, I should give you my contact info. If you are interested in being part of that committee, we will likely not start until January due to some other projects coming. So if you are interested, please email me, or you can email the Durham Opening Doors. And I will stop right there.
Thank you, Jonathan. Let me open up the floor to HSAC members if there are any questions for Mr. Crooms. Okay, great.
And let me just edit one thing I said, just to make sure I'm saying things correctly, is that it is the COC performance standards that we're going to be looking at. So I believe I also said written standards. Those actually fall under the policy and planning subcommittee. So apologize for the misspoken word there. We are looking at performance standards.
Thank you. So noted for the minutes. Thank you. All right, being there's no questions for Mr. Crooms, we will move right along to our CE admin designation. And we have a presentation from community development staff.
I didn't have a presentation prepared, but I can certainly just give some context and background. So, and sorry, I didn't plan to be on screen, so hi. So in the coordinated entry policies and procedures that were approved in summer of 2019, the policies laid out that the HSAC will vote to designate the entity that will serve as the coordinated entry administrator. The coordinated entry administrator is the role that's tasked with overseeing implementation of Durham's coordinated entry policies and procedures. For the previous year, I guess, just about a year, that role had been filled by the North Carolina Coalition to End Homelessness, with them notifying the city that they would no longer be able to fill that role. I have stepped in to serve in that role in an interim basis while the HSAC, while we wait for the HSAC to vote. We are recommending that the HSAC vote to have the Community Development Department serve as the coordinated entry administrator formally.
Okay, so let me open up the floor for voting for this to have community development serve as the CE administrator. We do have our quorum, so if folks can enter into the chat box. If you are in favor of community development being the CE administrator, if you can vote yay. If you are opposed to this recommendation, if you can vote no in the comment box. And please, if you are abstaining, if you can put that in your comment box. And hopefully, Angela, I'm not sure if you can type into the box. I know that you're in a community right now. So if you want to give us your verbal vote, that is fine.
Madam Chair, do we need a motion in a second?
Yes. I'll entertain a motion.
I will make a motion that community development be the CE admin.
Thank you. Thank you for
Second.
that. And Dr. Birch as second. Thank you for CE being the administrator. Thank you, Helen. Okay. All right. It looks like that recommendation has been accepted by way of vote. So community development will be our CE administrator. Thank you all. All right, so we will move right along to our second wave of ESG CV funds. update. And Mr. Davis, Colin, you have a presentation for us?
It's not a presentation, just an update. Since
Okay.
we brought it up at our last HSAC meeting, I wanted to circle back and give everyone a brief update of where we are with looking at this $2 million second wave of ESG COVID funds. And we've been having really good communication with providers and sort of teasing out where money currently is being allocated and where we anticipate needs. And we've got another meeting next week. So I will send out a link to that for anybody who would like to be part of that discussion. It'd be helpful to have more voices at the table to think through where these needs will be over the next 1 to 2 years. As we're looking at not just the $2 million that the city ESG funds have, but also an anticipated second round of ESG COVID funds coming from the state that should be coming sometime after the first of the year. How do we use these and get them spent in a timely manner to benefit the community? Because if we can't get them spent in time, we lose them. So it's really, we can allocate them, but whenever we allocate them, we need to make sure we can hit the ground rolling and get them spent. So we hopefully will have a finalized plan by our next HSAC meeting, but we as a group decided we would rather take our time and get as much input as we can rather than make impulsive decisions and put money where it may not be useful or may not be able to be spent. So that's why we don't have anything more substantial today for an update.
All right, thank you. Any questions for Colin? All right. So moving right along, the combined application, we're going to hear from Mr. Crooms.
All right. I am back again with yet another update here. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, our most recent review was for the combined funding application. We had 4 great applicants, 2 for emergency shelter funding, 2 for rapid rehousing funding. Scores were, I would say, pretty high, and made for a challenge as always in deciding how best to make a recommendation. We had no preferences as far as coming from the policy and planning committee, so preferences did not play a role, just simply on scoring. And you've got the memo there, so I won't rehash anything there, but again, just simply to say we have had 4 great applications. And I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
All right, doesn't sound like any questions. All right, thank you, Jonathan.
All right, thank you, Alicia.
So moving right along, so our 2019 to 2020 system performance, do you have any information for us, Hanalea?
Yes, I am going to be presenting to y'all on the system performance, and this is an in-depth data presentation and requires extensive notes, so Ruby has generously offered to do the slides for me while I read notes. So great, thanks Ruby. And I will just let you know, we can go to the first data slide. So as y'all may know, we have to submit as a COC our system performance on an annual basis. These metrics pull from those reporting functions that we report to HUD. This isn't everything we report to HUD on an annual basis, but these were the most relevant points in our estimation for an evaluation of how Durham is doing in terms of its system performance. all of this data that I'm presenting today was pulled from a period of October 1 to September 30th for the 18-19 comparison year, and then for the 19-20 most recent year. And I will be presenting both 18-19 Durham data for comparison, but then also some data from averages around the country, so we can see how we're performing in reference to some national averages as well. So to start with, there are two ways that HUD asks us to report on our performance in terms of length of time people spend homeless. The first metric that you see here on the left that says in programs, this is a metric that measures only the time that people spend enrolled in emergency shelter, street outreach, or transitional housing. So basically spent time that we know they were homeless because they were enrolled in a program where they would be qualified as homeless. The second metric that you see here on the right includes clients' reports of how long they spent homeless before they entered a program. So what we know is that when we only look at the time people spend in programs, that time is a vast underestimation of people's actual time spent in homelessness, because people spend a lot of time in homelessness where they're not being served by a program. And so over here on the right, we include that client estimation of how long they spent in homelessness as well. But of course, that should also be taken with a grain of salt, because clients can at times have a hard time reporting their own homelessness. So Ruby, can you move to the next slide? So these are some conclusions on what we found when we looked at a comparison of our length of time homeless metrics from last year to this year. So when you only include the length of time that clients were enrolled in shelter or street outreach, the average length of time increased by between 9 and 13 days. And this is in red here because this is a negative outcome for Durham, that our length of time in programs is increasing before people exit homelessness. But on the other hand, when you include clients' time that they self-report their homelessness on top of the time that they spent in programs, the length of time decreased by between 52 and 60 days. So what could this mean? This could actually mean, and of course we can't be sure, that something positive is happening in Durham, because it is possible that more of the time that clients spend in homelessness is happening when they're being served by either emergency shelter or street outreach. And that's why the overall time is going down. So even though people are spending more time in programs, overall, the time it took us to house someone from the beginning of their homelessness to the end got shorter. So we're not sure that that's what's going on, but it's possible that this is actually a rebalancing due to the changes in coordinated entry, where people are getting into shelter faster, spending less time in unsheltered homelessness, and getting out of homelessness faster overall. It's also possible that that's not what's going on here, but that is my best guess as to why the data looks like this. Ruby, can you flip back to the first slide? So just wanted to share these numbers one more time. So our average length of time spent in homelessness for 19-20, if you only include the time that people spend in programs, is 105 days. It goes up to 412 days if you include their self-reported length of time homeless. And then the median for only time spent in programs is 68 days, which goes up to 180 when you include client self-report of homelessness. Any questions of this data on length of time spent homeless before I move on to the next data element?
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Lloyd. Annalee, I would want to encourage people to be mindful that while the average in programs went up by 9 days, the median went down by 4 days, which suggests to me that the median measures the people in the middle, right? but the average, so the median is heading in the right direction, and the average suggests that we had some long stayers that are increasing the average time overall.
That's correct. Yeah. When our median and our average are being pulled apart, that indicates that outliers, people on the ends, are pulling up the average. And we do know that, of course, we have some very challenging cases that have really presented challenges to the whole COC to get housed and have really drawn up that average for sure. Any other questions or comments? All right, if you can move 2 slides ahead, Ruby. Thanks. So I also want to share how we're doing in terms of our length of time spent in emergency shelter compared to averages from around the country. So it's difficult to know what the most relevant metric is. So we pulled a few here. So the average length of time spent in emergency shelter in Durham in 2019 was 105 days. Compared to the national average of 127 days, we're doing pretty well. We're a little below the average. But compared to similar size COCs, so mid-urban size COCs from around the country, we're a little above their average of 97. And then compared to COCs in the Southeast, including North Carolina, we're even further above their average of 84. So what you'll see as we go through this presentation is that in general, Durham is performing above average. So whether or not you think we're at the average or like a little worse than the average, depending on what you think is the most relevant metric, what we know here is that this is the metric where Durham is struggling the most. Because everywhere else, compared to averages, whichever one you pick, Durham is doing really well. This is the one where we're either at the average or a little below it. So I think this is definitely the place where we can identify as needing the most work as a COC. Any questions about how we compare to these national averages?
This is Tracy. Are there any things that are contributing to the length of time in Durham in emergency shelter?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tracy. I would also want to offer an opportunity to have any providers that are on the call offer their insights as well. I'm just looking at my notes quickly to see if I had any hypotheses as to why this was.
Well, one of my theories was that, the demand and supply of affordable housing for individuals to transition into, as well as other housing options along the continuum, whether they're transitional housing or other short-term, may not be readily available for those individuals. So I'm just wondering whether or not that just, again, curious as to what contributed to the length of time, because it's not that far off from other comparable size COCs.
Right. So what I can tell you, what I know at this point, and you'll see this as we go along, and they're intrinsically related, is that last year compared to the year before, we housed fewer people. And a lot fewer, like half as many. And so we'll get into that data later, but, and there's a lot of reasons that I'll get into as to why that happened, and what I know and what I don't know about why that happened. But you can imagine that if we housed half as many people, that would pull up our length of time. And so it does seem to me that as we struggle to get housing resources on board, of course, that's going to be a major factor in this length of time. And as we lose certain housing resources, which I'll also talk about as we talk about our permanent exits. But there are other things as well. We've been trying to really bump up our housing focused case management in Durham, and that's something that can really help us. It's a best practice that really has not been fully implemented in Durham, and is something that could help us to get closer to national standards. And of course, in Durham, we don't want to be average. We want to be above average. As you'll see with most of our data, we are above average. So we're really aiming to be below that 84, not at it. And I see Ricky has a question from the gallery. I'm fine with it if you are, Alicia. I'm seeing a nod. So yeah, Ricky, go ahead.
Thanks. I was wondering if the increase in the length of time in shelter might have anything to do with how we have really prioritized the hardest to serve households for housing opportunities available in the community.
Yeah, and a lot of this, Ricky, is really closely related to the next data metric. So I want to, yeah, I think we're like sort of pulling into that exits to permanent housing. So I want to continue this conversation as we look at that next data element so we can have more context, because I have a lot of relevant numbers to give to y'all. Is there any questions beyond the ones about exits to permanent housing and those permanent housing resources being available? I know, Sheldon, you have one. Is this something that is just specific to length of time?
We can't hear you, Sheldon. Yeah.
Yeah, so mine was going to be around the availability of affordable housing in the comparable areas. So I think you're probably going to get to that.
Yeah, let's go right into this next metric, because these two are just so tied together, it's difficult to pull them apart. So, oh, I forgot I'm not controlling this slide. Ruby, would you mind moving to the next slide for me? Thank you. Oh, I apologize. I mistook the order of these slides. So put a pin in that till we get to exits to permanent housing. Before we get there, we're going to talk about entries into first-time homelessness. So the way that we're measuring first-time homelessness here is important to know. It's not really first-time homelessness. What HUD considers first-time homeless is someone who has not been in the homeless system in the last 2 years. So it's really a proxy for how long it's been since someone's been homeless. So just keep that in mind. It's also important to note that this isn't everyone who touches the homeless system. This only measures people who went into emergency shelter, transitional housing, or permanent housing in the last 2 years. So the big items here that are not included are street outreach and coordinated entry, okay? Now with that in mind, we have some reason to feel really good this year. And I'm just gonna flip back to my notes to give y'all the data on these. So, so what we know is that the number of people experiencing first-time homelessness who actually entered emergency shelter, transitional housing, or permanent housing last year decreased by 201 people, which is a reduction of 4% in the rate of first-time homelessness from the previous year. So the previous year, we had seen a rate of 71% of people going into these programs were coming into these programs as first-time homeless. And then last year, only 67% of those people were first-time homeless. So that's really positive. And my belief is that this is due to the implementation of system-wide coordinated entry and in particular diversion, right? That a lot of these people are being diverted out of homelessness and never having to enter one of these programs. So that's a really positive thing for our community and was one of the primary goals of system-wide diversion. Any questions about these numbers here?
Hanale, I wanted to ask just about the percentage number. Wouldn't we want that number to increase and not decrease? To me, if the number is decreasing, that means we've got more frequent flyers with repeat episodes of homelessness.
So what you want is that basically what you want is you want less inflow into your system, right? We've got the people we've got. You don't want new people becoming homeless, right? So the idea now, if overall just our numbers of people experiencing homelessness overall were just skyrocketing, that would be concerning overall, right? Which I think is what you're getting to, Ryan. But as you can see here with these numbers at the top, that's not the case. The number of people overall who entered one of these 3 programs went down. So the reason I'm not really harping on that is because I don't believe the number of people who experienced homelessness last year actually went down. What I believe is that the number was flat, and because of COVID, it dropped in the last few months. because of our reduction in shelter capacity. So I don't really want to tout, oh, wow, we had fewer people experiencing homelessness. I think that what actually happened was just a reduction in shelter capacity for several months. But what we do know is homelessness did not skyrocket last year. So basically what we see here is we maintained the base of homelessness we already had, and then we reduced inflow into homelessness for new folks. Does that make sense?
It does. I also think that HUD has got a goal about homelessness being non-recurring. And when that percentage goes down, that suggests that more folks are recurring.
So there's actually a separate metric that we're going to go into later, which is recurrent homelessness. I would caution against conflating this number with an assumption that homelessness is actually recurring more often, which is not what this number indicates.
Okay. Can you clarify? I know that we've seen a trend for kind of fewer transitional beds. How many beds do we have that are transitional housing right now? And is it okay to say where those are in our system? I didn't know if the per diem beds are still in there or where that number's coming from.
So the bed count is something I'm going to defer to Lloyd because that's more of his domain. And Lloyd, I'm putting you completely on the spot. So it is okay if you do not know the answer to this question.
No, we currently only have 2 transitional housing projects, and both of them are grant and per diem projects, Volunteers of America's Maple Court and TROSA's grant per diem beds. And cumulatively, that's 44 beds currently.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lloyd.
Sure.
Any other questions about our first-time homelessness numbers?
The only other thing I'd say, Hanalea, is I'd be very curious to see singles versus families broken out, and just to get a sense of are there differences between those populations based on what we're looking at so far?
Sure, I think that that's a great question, Ryan. This particular report, this SPM report, doesn't allow me to do that. I can definitely play around with some other ways to do that reporting and get back to y'all on that for sure. All right, so if you will go to the next slide, Ruby. So this next slide shows you what y'all were asking me about earlier, which is that companion piece to length of time homelessness, which is successful exits from homelessness. In most cases, successful exits are permanent housing. The exception is street outreach, where a successful exit is also considered going into some sort of temporary location like shelter and getting off the street. And I'm just going to flip back to my notes so I can give you the takeaways here. All right, so overall, successful housing exits or retention in permanent housing decreased by 12% between these 2 years. So that is obviously very concerning. Broken down by program type, successful exits from street outreach had the largest drop of 26%. I believe this is actually a fluke and not a real concerning number, and is the result of the rapid end to street outreach that we had due to defunding in that year and the need to exit a ton of people. So what you'll see on this number is that just the total number of exits overall went way up from 43 in 1 year to 116. So that basically is what happened, is street outreach had to exit a bunch of people at once and just could not get them to a positive exit. So I think some of these numbers are slightly inflated by that happening. Then we see a 20% increase in, a 20% decrease in successful exits from rapid rehousing, transitional housing, and shelter. And I'm gonna break those down for y'all in a minute and go into those deeper, because that's the place where we really wanna dig in, because that's the most concerning number. Then we see an actual increase in successful exits or retention in permanent supportive housing. It's an increase of 4%. So that's how we end up at that 12% metric, is the successful exits or retention in permanent supportive housing balance out our challenges with exiting people from the other programs a little bit. So why did exits from rapid rehousing, transitional housing, and emergency shelter go down. So here's what I can tell you. 7 to 8% of this reduction is due to the loss of the housing choice vouchers in that year. So what I did was I went through and I actually counted up the number of people that were housed with the housing choice voucher and adjusted if we had still had that as a housing option, how many more people would have been housed. And what came out to is 7 to 8% additional people would have been housed. So what that leaves us with is a 4 to 5% reduction in our permanent housing exits due to some other cause. So at this point, the good news is our housing choice vouchers are back. We're using them again. And so we can feel good that this year we won't have that deflating our numbers. But there's still that 4 to 5% reduction that we have to worry about. So what was going on that caused these exits to reduce by 4 to 5%? So clients served in rapid rehousing overall reduced by 55% from 1819 to 1920. So that's a massive reduction in the number of people served, right? Exits from rapid rehousing reduced by 14%. So obviously, because rapid rehousing is one of the most important housing options that shelters have for their clients, that rapid rehousing change pushed back on the shelters and I believe caused probably in the majority of that 4 to 5% reduction overall in permanent housing exits. So of that 14% reduction in permanent housing exits from rapid rehousing, 9% of that was due to the loss of the vouchers. So again, you end up with about a 5% reduction that was not due to the loss of the vouchers. So why is that? So I tried to break this out further to kind of dig in, and here's what I found. The successful exit rate for singles in rapid rehousing dropped by 4%, while that for families dropped by 14%. So it dropped overall for everyone, but for families, it was a lot worse than for singles. I think part of this could be the more heavier reliance on vouchers for families, and the need to really supplement their income because of the larger household size. But I also think there's something else going on here. And what I know is that, I'm sorry, I'm just reading my note. Okay. So even though successful exits from rapid rehousing went down, the impact on the overall system was very small. It was negligible. So when I first saw this and saw, okay, permanent housing exits reduced by 14% in rapid rehousing, I adjusted what if rapid rehousing had maintained its numbers. Actually, it only affected that overall drop by 1%. So I believe that most of the remainder here is due to the reduction in the number of people served in rapid rehousing. So not the exits from rapid rehousing, but just the number of people served overall. And I think that number of people served metric does get to the questions that people were asking earlier, which is about the shift in the focus of who we were prioritizing for and who we were serving in rapid rehousing. So in 2019, 2020, in that year, we removed requirements that clients not have income before going to rapid rehousing. So you can imagine it takes longer to house and stabilize that client than a client who comes in with income, right? We also started prioritizing higher vulnerability clients. So all of this sort of gets to why we might have had that drop in the number of clients served. Also, the housing choice vouchers had an impact on this. A lot of clients that were served in rapid rehousing the previous year went in with a voucher layered on top of rapid rehousing and went out right away. So there was this utilization of rapid rehousing layered with a voucher that led to a lot of clients being served very quickly that we just weren't having in 1920. So that's a lot of information and a lot of analysis. I want to get to what this means for how we do nationally, because it's actually good news. But I want to pause here because that was just, I'm sure, information overload as I try to give my best estimation of what's going on and see what questions people have. for thoughts, comments. I know, Sheldon, you asked a question about affordable housing earlier. The answer is I don't really know the answer to that question. It makes sense, right, that fewer people could be served in rapid rehousing if housing is more expensive, right?
Right.
But I don't really know what the actual impact of that was. I mean, maybe rapid rehousing would be able to come back and look at that, but it makes sense logically, but I don't have any numbers to bear out what the real impact of increasing of housing costs would be.
Okay. I do think your other comments still are on point, because I know that's one of the things that we saw as far as the vouchers definitely impacting our ability to get some individuals housed. Also, just the overall prioritization of the individuals with more barriers definitely led to a more challenging environment. And also then us just having less people that came through in order to get the numbers up as well. So just a combination of various things.
Any other thoughts or comments or questions about this?
I just want to make a quick add, and that, I think we saw this first with the family system, and now we're seeing it with, kind of the new coordinated entry system, and that diversion is a strategic add to our system, and that the cost per household is low. We're keeping folks out of shelter. And, I think there's a tendency to kind of, celebrate the success, which in some ways is appropriate. There is a flip side to diversion. And the flip side is your shelter population gets more difficult to serve. And it's more difficult for rapid rehousing. It's more difficult for permanent supportive housing. It's more difficult for any, housing intervention that we've got out there. We know that the HCVs are few and far between right now. At least for families, we've had, significant difficulty getting folks to qualify based on the prioritization for permanent supportive housing. And at least for us at Families Moving Forward, if they're not getting rapidly rehoused, they're not getting out of the shelter. And I think that, folks with zero income, repeat episodes, large family sizes, those are very difficult folks to house when they have prior evictions, criminal records, and some of the characteristics that we see in our population. So I'm not surprised to kind of see the numbers increase a little bit with length of stay. The last several years, we've had small cuts in length of stay. We're expecting our length of stay to increase a bit in the current year.
I think to Ryan's point, this is Colin, to Ryan's point, as systems shift to prioritize the most vulnerable, your resources are geared towards those most vulnerable that tend to take a period of time to find landlords to rent to, and also require more financial resources to continue to sustain that housing opportunity. The way to offset that is looking at how do you get people out of who are experiencing homelessness, who are lower barrier, to sort of bring that average cost and that average length of stay down. And how do you sort of walk that fine line between helping everybody who's most vulnerable and mixing in some who are less vulnerable that are lower cost, so your averages start coming down across a system. And that's the trickiest piece, is juggling that and finding the resources to meet, the first time homeless who has a history of stability, who may need a little bit of money to get in the, get a security deposit in the first month's rent, and then they'll be totally fine. Whereas that person may be in a long waiting list for a rapid rehousing financial assistance, or waiting for a voucher that may never come. So it's important to keep those in mind as we're looking at how the system prioritizes and how we use the funds that we have coming in. And we can't build an entire system around housing vouchers, because we all know housing vouchers come and they go, and you never know when they'll come back at times.
Thanks, Colin. That's actually a great segue onto the next slide, if you don't mind, Ruby. Okay, so here is why this might not actually actually be bad news for the COC. So I will be the first one to say, when I saw that our permanent housing rates were dropping, I was very alarmed. However, when you compare us to the national COC data, the story changes. And here's what we see. Durham was outperforming all of the national averages by a lot. So in 2018, our average of percent of exits that were to permanent housing was 69%. That's in comparison to 42% for the national average, 33% for similar size COCs, and 43% for COCs in the Southeast. In 2019, that dropped to 56%, but that's still way higher than all of the national averages. Now, if this trend continued and we dropped and we dropped and we dropped, that would be a bad thing. But here's what I think may actually be going on. I think we were artificially inflating our numbers because we were prioritizing lower barrier clients for these resources. And because a lot of these clients were not showing up in our programs because we weren't counting them because they were not in shelter. So I think that it's possible that this is actually a positive move for the Durham COC. That even though overall fewer of these exits are permanent housing, we're giving more people who really need the assistance a chance. And yes, some of them may not succeed and may take a few times, but what we know about best practices is that's actually what it takes. Housing first principles tell you that you have to just give that client another chance, try them in housing, don't put a lot of barriers on the front end of it, and see if it works this time. So I think it's possible that this is actually reflecting a positive move that is going on for the Durham COC. And as time goes on, all of these numbers will stabilize and we'll start to see the bearing out on, for instance, the length of time and all these other things. We know that 2019 was a year of transition in a lot of ways for us. And I think that might be what's causing this. But I do think that 69% number, because it is so inflated over the national averages, could indicate that it is not a positive thing that we were sort of picking the clients that went into these programs by who we thought could succeed. Now that's just a guess, and that's my own evaluation. But I think it is interesting to see that we are still outperforming national averages even as our numbers drop. So I want to give an opportunity for anyone to give thoughts or questions about this. I know it's a lot to process, so it's also okay to just sit with it. All right. One last metric, if you'll move to the next slide, Ruby. Ricky, this does not include diversion. The SPM numbers do not include any data from coordinated entry. They don't measure it, they don't pull it in. So the last metric, and this is one I think, Ryan, you were asking about earlier, is returns to homelessness within 2 years. So the news is slightly, but good in this, when we look at returns to homelessness. And I'm just gonna pull up my notes here. So overall, returns decreased by 0.38%. So that's negligible, it's barely anything. But when we're already running on such small margins, I mean, our return rates are already very, very low. It is meaningful. And as I break out what you see across programs, I think it becomes more interesting. So what we see here is that returns from street outreach increased by 10%. Again, that was pulling up our number because of the fluke of what happened to our funding. So we just kind of have to set that aside, I think, for this year. Returns from shelter decreased by 2%. And that is small, but positive when we're already running on small margins. So this gets to your question, Ryan, is if first-time homelessness entries are reducing, does that mean that recurrent homelessness is increasing? And the answer is no. Recurrent homelessness and first-time homelessness are actually going down. So it's very positive across the board. Where the numbers pulled up were returns from transitional housing increased by 4%, and returns from permanent housing increased by 0.67%. So all of this sort of averages out to a small decrease. But I think, I don't really know why returns from transitional housing would increase. I don't really have enough day-to-day interaction with transitional housing to know why that would have happened. interested to know if anyone else has any other thoughts, but I do think that the shelter numbers are promising. Questions here, thoughts?
Well, I think if you look at the overall numbers, we don't have a whole lot of data. I mean, particularly for street outreach and transitional housing, you're talking in terms of absolute numbers. In 2018, 2019, 0 people from street outreach up to 2, which is very negligible. And transitional housing also went from 0 to 1 person. So
yeah, that's a very good point, Lloyd.
Sometimes you want to look at the numbers rather than the percentages.
You're running on such small margins here of people that the numbers inflate really quickly. And so you could have 1 person and that would throw off all your numbers. I think that's a great point. So if there are no other questions, the last thing I want to do here is I do want to provide y'all with some context as to how we're doing with returns to homelessness in comparison to national averages. So if you don't mind going to the next slide, Ruby. So here is more good news. Durham was already outperforming the national averages even before our further little bit reduction this year. And this is why I think this is meaningful. So the national average of returns to homelessness within 2 years is 9%. Similar size COCs is 11%. And it was 9% for COCs in the Southeast. So we were already at 7%. So we're already on a really small margin as of 2018. So you can only pull down that so much. So I think the fact that we even pulled it down slightly is meaningful in that we're still pushing this number down where we're already really outperforming the averages and should feel pretty good about where we're at.
Hanalea, can I ask, with HMIS system, I wasn't sure if there was enough standardization, if somebody that was homeless got on a bus and went to Atlanta and became homeless in Atlanta, are we able to capture that, or are we just seeing what's happening in terms of folks resurfacing locally?
This is only Durham. Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have a context as to, what happens when that person leaves. What we do know is they didn't come back here, right? But no, I mean, this is Durham and it's Durham alone. Any other questions or just thoughts or comments, questions overall, because this is my last slide.
I'm going to lay Lloyd again. Let me add, for those who may wonder where we pulled the data for the national and COCs in the Southwest and similar size COCs. These percentages were taken from the National Annual Homeless Assessment Report, Part 2, that HUD released at the end of September of this year. It's available on the at hudexchange.info. If you just search for Annual Homeless Assessment Report, or AHAR, and towards the end, I think it might be in an appendices, there's discussion of these system performance measures, so several of them at least, and that's where we pulled this information.
I just want to thank you for the presentation. I might be in the minority, but I love looking at the stats and trying to figure out what's going on. So I just want to thank you for doing this. And I'd love to do this multiple times a year.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I love data. It's my favorite thing. So, as long as y'all are interested and want more of this, I'll keep bringing it back to you. And it really helps me out also to know what some of y'all have been very vocal in telling me what you want to know about and what's interesting. So that also really helps me to figure out what to bring back to y'all and what to analyze.
All right, thank you. And yes, I will echo the same, Hanalea. There's been some good questions over in the chat box from both our HSAC committee and our gallery. So thank you for that. I know that Lloyd mentioned in a portion of the comments that we can take a look at the average length of time in the RRH program. So thank you, community development team, for putting together. I would be interested in seeing these trends through our winter months as we go into the spring, all of that. So thank you to community development. Hold on just a second. I'm sorry, I'm getting delivered some of my Pepsis, y'all. So yes, that brings us to the end of our meeting for this month. I wanted to open up the floor for any announcements that folks might have. HSAC, CLC members, any announcements? Glad to see we have a guest. I thought I saw Mr. Terry Alibi. Pleasure to have you this month joining us. I don't know if Dr. Birch is still with us. Didn't know if there were any updates. I know between now and the next time that we all meet, folks, if you already haven't, we're going to be getting out, using our voices and voting in our various communities and our districts. So thank you in advance for playing a role in your community. I don't have any more announcements. Just to remind our HSAC exec committee that we are going to be meeting on this Friday from about 9 to 11, so we can map out this next year's plan, kind of have a timeline on some of the things that we would like to work on this next year. So looking forward to that meeting on Friday morning. If there aren't any other
announcement.
Yes, go ahead, Ruby.
Hi, I sent out several emails to HSAC members to please make sure that you complete your conflict of interest form. It's online this year, so really simple. The link was in the email that went out with the agenda down at the very bottom. I've also sent out several emails. So the deadline is this Friday. So if all HSAC members could please get in your conflict of interest form. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruby. Thank you for that announcement. And thank you. I see a comment in the chat box from Dr. Collins about, I think his entry is hosting a Thanksgiving drive for the homeless. We are in need of blankets, sleeping bags to hand out to clients in one of the parks in Durham. So please reach out to Entry Point if you're interested in donating. Thank you, Dr. Collins. All right, that brings us to the end of our October meeting. I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
I move we adjourn.
I said nobody wants to leave, go home. Okay, thank you.
Second the motion.
All right, thank you, Janine, and thank you for seconding that. I think it was Helen.
Renee.
Okay, thank you, Renee. All right, so moved. We are adjourned. See everybody next month.